Begin. I wanted to begin with a quote from Fitzgerald from 1939, almost at the end of his life, when he was nostalgic in many ways for his lost youth and also for his lost sense of America, which sort of dissipated over the course of the 30s. He writes, "I think America and its history is the most beautiful history in the world. It is the history of me and my people. It is the history of all aspiration, not just the American dream, but the human dream. And if I came at the end of it, that too is a place in the line of pioneers." So again, you get this sense that Fitzgerald sees himself at that moment as at the end of an arc, at the end of a certain figment of this dream, this American dream that is also the human dream. So let's go back to the beginning and look at the early years of Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald. He was born in 1896. He died in 1940, a tragically young life, but a life that, in fact, was filled with an extraordinary amount of events and of success and of failure as well. He lived a vibrant life for those 44 years. He was born in St. Paul, Minnesota. He died in Hollywood, California, and he was the son of an immigrant, a woman whose father had come over from Ireland, Mary McQuillan Fitzgerald, and a man named Edward Fitzgerald, who had been a descendant of Francis Scott Key. Does everybody know who Francis Scott Key was? Yes, the composer of the Star-Spangled Banner. And he had an interesting family background in that his mother, the immigrant mother, came from a great deal of money. Her father had been very successful in business, and so she came from a sort of wealthy background, but it was an immigrant background. And his father, on the other hand, came from what might be called a sort of downwardly mobile background. His great ancestor, Francis Scott Key, had of course been one of the most significant figures of the Revolution, but subsequently the family sort of decayed. The money was lost, and there seems to have been a lot of alcoholism in the family. And so Fitzgerald always felt that there was a tension between his mother and his father in terms of the way they thought about wealth and status, class, and social standing. Fitzgerald wrote about his family, quote, "The black Irish half of the family, that is the McQuillans, had the money and looked down upon the Maryland side of the family, the Fitzgeralds, who had and really had that certain series of reticences and obligations that go under the poor old shattered word breeding. So I developed a two-cylinder inferiority complex." The mother looks down on the father for being, you know, a sort of ne'er-do-well. The father looks down on the mother for being an upstart immigrant, and Fitzgerald was caught in the middle. Fitzgerald attended a prep school, which he was very proud about, and it marked him in his early years, especially being on the football team. That meant a lot to him, and he would continue to identify with sports and with football in particular. You can see him right here. He's the very handsome, almost beautiful young man in this photograph. But while he was at this prep school, which wasn't a particularly distinguished prep school, it was a sort of mediocre prep school, but nevertheless, he continued to feel somehow this inferiority complex toward his peers. He wrote about his teenage years, "Socially, I was convinced that I had personality, charm, magnetism, poise, and the ability to dominate others. Generally, I knew that at bottom I lacked the essentials. At the last, I knew I had no real courage, perseverance, or self-respect." So this layered sense of his social skills, of which Fitzgerald is, of course, the great chronicler of sort of American social mores, but underneath a sense of sort of emptiness, that he didn't really have those skills. And at the very bottom, no real courage, no perseverance, or even self-respect. So it's quite a bracing self-assessment.
When did he write that?
He wrote that in the 30s in an essay that he wrote for the Crack-Up. And I'm not sure exactly what the date was of that, but it was a retrospective account. And then in his short story, The Freshest Boy, which is about the freshman year at Newman School, he described his main character. He had indeed become the scapegoat, the immediate villain, the sponge which absorbed all malice and irritability. And in fact, Fitzgerald was sort of bullied while he was at school, although he figured out a way, and we'll talk about this some more when we look at some of the characters in his novels, he figured out a way through charm, magnetism, and poise to get back at his bullies. Fitzgerald eventually matriculated at Princeton University, a place that is described in his first novel, This Side of Paradise, by the main character, Amory Blaine. He says, "I want to go to Princeton. I don't know why, but I think of all Harvard men as sissies, like I used to be, and all Yale men as wearing big blue sweaters and smoking pipes. I think of Princeton as being lazy and good-looking and aristocratic, you know, like a spring day." So, I mean, this is his goal in going to college, is to be sort of lazy, good-looking, and aristocratic. And his distinctions between the various Ivies are I think, very amusing there. While he was at Princeton, he worried a lot about his wealth and social status, as we've said about the early prep school years as well. And again, in a retrospective essay, he says, "That was always my experience, a poor boy in a rich town, a poor boy in a rich boys' school, a poor boy in a rich man's club at Princeton." At Princeton, Fitzgerald studied, or you could say majored in, 3 subjects. The first, obviously, literature. It was at Princeton where he really began to read. He had always written a lot and had always published, but most of his early efforts were poetry or plays and a few short stories. It was at Princeton that he actually began to think about writing something longer, although he wasn't to do that until after he had left Princeton. But he was obviously very attracted to writing a major work of fiction. His very famous American literary critic, Christian Gauss, who was his professor at Princeton, says, "Fitzgerald was impatient of discipline. He possessed a far less solid background of reading than his friends, but was deeply interested in the problems of art and its techniques." And his favorite authors at college, among others, H.G. Wells, John Keats, and James Joyce. I mean, I think you can see elements of all of those authors in Fitzgerald's work, and we can talk about that more if you'd like to. He also studied, and I'm being facetious here a little bit, he studied New York City. I mean, Fitzgerald was a notorious, just a bad student, a C student or worse. He failed courses right and left, and he spent a lot of his time in New York City when he should have been in class at Princeton. But he couldn't stay away, and you've got to think about the time when he was at Princeton, how exciting New York City would have been at that time. And in many ways, I think of Fitzgerald as a New York writer, to the extent that he captures the excitement of a city developing and growing at this incredible moment. And you'll remember that wonderful phrase from The Great Gatsby. The narrator, Nick Carraway, says, "The city, New York City, seen from the Queensboro Bridge, is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty of the world." And in a later essay, My Lost City, which is a wonderful account of New York City in the 20s, but written from the perspective of the 30s, he says, "New York had all the iridescence of the beginning of the world." And the third subject that Fitzgerald studied at Princeton was women. Fitzgerald was and is one of the greatest writers of women, I think. Some of his female characters drive my students crazy because they think they don't have enough independence and drive, but I think he's very good on female characters, and I hope I can explain that further. But while he's at Princeton and he's developing this sensibility, this understanding of women, he's falling in love with a series of women, and in particular one named Ginevra King, who he had a passion for between 1915 and 1917. She was 16 at the time, and he was 20, and he was entranced with this young woman. Fitzgerald's biographer, Don Schemer, says that King remained for Fitzgerald an archetype for the alluring, independent, and upper-class woman, ultimately unattainable by someone of a modest social background like himself. So Ginevra ended up being the sort of prototype, the archetype of all of these women that he would explore in his various novels, these sort of inaccessible, beautiful young women who he will soon refer to under a term called, that he helped to define, the term flapper. Women who had a certain independence and a certain sexual freedom, but who also, in a way, were never going to be available to somebody from his background. And Ginevra ended up being the model for Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby, among other figures. Again, Fitzgerald was not a model student, but he was he had a great dream, and that was to go into the Army. After Princeton put Fitzgerald on academic probation in 1917, he joined the U.S. Army as a second lieutenant and was stationed in Montgomery, Alabama. And it was there, or just before he went there, it's not quite clear when he started, but at some point around that time, he started his first novel, This Side of Paradise. And he claims to have written it in 3 months, writing it inside the book of military maneuvers that he was supposed to be studying, and he was writing his novel in a sort of little notebook hidden inside this book. I don't know, that could be apocryphal, but I think it's an interesting kind of story. And here he looks, I would say, very gallant. He never saw action, which was a big disappointment to him. The war ended by the time that he was actually meant to be deployed, and he always felt, again, that somehow he had missed that experience, which so many young men at that time had. In Montgomery, he met a woman named Zelda Sayer, who became his wife. She too lived a tragically short life, 1900 to 1948, and in many ways had a very, very difficult life. Had suffered deeply from mental illness that became more acute as she got older. But Fitzgerald fell deeply in love with this young woman who seemed again a sort of twin to this Ginevra King that he had fallen in love with. And he wrote in a letter to a friend, "Zelda's the only god I have now." But ironically, within about 2 weeks after marrying her, he confessed that he wished he hadn't. So from the very beginning, it was very difficult. They got married in 1920. Here you see a picture of the young couple in very 20s garb, flapper-esque. You can see how Zelda would herself become a sort of prototype for the flapper in this period. And you can get a sense from her outfit and from his a little bit what it meant to be a sort of chic young person in the early 1920s. Zelda was, though, very critical of F. Scott Fitzgerald because, and it got worse, she seemed to feel that he had taken a lot of his material, especially for this side of Paradise and The Beautiful and the Damned, his second novel, from Zelda's own journals. And later on in Save Me the Waltz, her own autobiography, she sort of makes mention of Fitzgerald's borrowing of her work and has this wonderful phrase, "Mr. Fitzgerald seems to believe that plagiarism begins at home." As I said, Fitzgerald's first major novel was This Side of Paradise, a novel that originally couldn't find a publisher, and that was sort of rescued from the scrap heap by a very important editor named Maxwell Perkins, who some of you may have heard of. He too would help launch the career of Ernest Hemingway, and was an extremely important literary figure. I mean, he deserves a lot of recognition for sort of launching these figures' careers. And he found this novel and felt like it really spoke to the generation of the 20s. It was a novel that, it's a very difficult novel to read. It's not at all written in a straightforward way. It uses lots of different genre. It uses poetry, poems, poetry, plays, narrative dialogue, interspersed with straightforward prose. So it's an experimental text. It's in many ways the most experimental text that Fitzgerald wrote. But it's not an easy read, and even though it was his most successful novel, it has more or less not, it's not read much nowadays at all. What Fitzgerald did in this novel was to sort of create a couple of new types, human types. And again, Maxwell Perkins, among others, felt that Fitzgerald had really spoken to his generation. He was doing something that no other writer had done before that point. The first type was the so-called lost young man. Remember that this generation would be referred to as a lost generation by Gertrude Stein in 1926. But already Fitzgerald is anticipating that characterization with this figure of the lost young man. And usually this is, at least in the phrase the lost generation, it refers to the young men who returned to America after the First World War and were faced with this sort of alienation of the 20s. But in the case of Fitzgerald, he's really talking about an early, because he was writing the novel while he was stationed in Montgomery, Alabama. So it's before the war has ended. But he's writing still about this sensibility of a kind of alienated young man, based very much on Fitzgerald himself. In fact, the first version of the novel was written in the first person. And Perkins said to him, no, you need distance on this character, write it in the third person. So Fitzgerald very much based that novel on himself. Amory Blaine, the main character, as I said, attends Princeton, strives to succeed socially, searches for meaning underneath superficialities, but finds only himself. The last line of the book, which is, and the final chapter is referred to as, the egotist becomes a personage. That's the last chapter of the book. Has Amory Blaine, and see if you can recognize any echoes in these final two sentences. He stretched out his arms to the crystalline, radiant sky. I know myself, he cried, but that is all. Does anybody hear any echoes of other Fitzgerald? The ending of The Great Gatsby, do you remember that? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. The end of Gatsby. I can't quite find the passage, but at the very end, Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther. And there's that feeling of sort of going into the future like that and finding yourself in the future. So again, I think there's a sort of anticipation of Gatsby in that final sentence. Another type that he created, as I suggested, was, or that he helped to create, obviously he's picking up on these currents in the air, was the figure of the flapper. And she really dominates, as much as the book is about Amory Blaine, it's Rosalind Connage who really dominates the book. And the figure of the flapper is in this figure of Rosalind, is based on Ginevra King, who we saw, and also on Zelda Sayer, a sort of composite of the two. Her characteristics: sexually liberated, passionate, glamorous. Glamour is such an important word for Fitzgerald. It's not a word we use so much nowadays, but it meant everything to Fitzgerald. Glamorous, active, independent. The flapper was a sort of icon of the period in literature and film, and obviously there's a lot of tie-ins to the beginning of Hollywood and the star system in Hollywood. But I wanted to read you a description of Rosalind from this side of paradise. If Rosalind could be spoiled, the process would have been complete by this time. But as a matter of fact, her disposition is not all it should be. She wants what she wants when she wants it, and she is prone to make everyone around her pretty miserable when she doesn't get it. But in the true sense, she is not spoiled. Her fresh enthusiasm, her will to grow and learn, her endless faith in the inexhaustibility of romance, her courage and fundamental honesty, these things are not spoiled. There are long periods when she cordially loathes her whole family. She is quite unprincipled. Her philosophy is carpe diem for herself and laissez-faire for others. She loves shocking stories. She has that coarse streak that usually goes with natures that are both fine and big. She wants people to like her, but if they do not, it never worries her or changes her. She is by no means a model character. And it's useful in that description, I think, to hear what Fitzgerald is challenging or what he's reacting against. And if you can hear in the background of that description the figure of the Victorian lady, the very proper Victorian woman, morally upright, maternal, certainly not sexually liberated, but always sort of proper and having the right values. And then you can see how somebody like Rosalind would be so shocking to that kind of figure, and how much Fitzgerald wanted to embrace this new figure of a sort of independent or liberated young woman. So I think it's important to get a sense, because we don't hear the shock so much nowadays because we're so far beyond that in terms of how women act in public. But he's picking up on something really important for the time.
Who is the picture?
That is, that's, what's her name? Clara Bow.
Oh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I can go back. Let me see. Yeah. Isn't she great? Somehow everybody was more beautiful back then, don't you think? I mean, it was the black and white photography, I think. I just wanted to give you a little more description of her as a physical entity. This has interested me a lot, the flapper's body, because it was a very distinct type. The flapper is an aesthetic ideal. There was that shade of glorious yellow hair, the desire to imitate which supports the dye industry. There was the eternal kissable mouth, small, slightly sensual, and utterly disturbing. There were gray eyes and an unimpeachable skin with 2 spots of vanishing color. She was slender and athletic, without underdevelopment, and it was a delight to watch her move about a room, walk along a street, swing a golf club, or turn a cartwheel. And this really captures for me the kind of physicality of these young women. I mean, the one thing he doesn't talk about is the smoking, because these were also young women who smoked as a way of showing how liberated they were. But especially that description of her walking along a street, swinging a golf club or turning, you get this sense of women just free in their bodies and freely moving. Also remember the fashions of the time and swinging skirts and things like that, that there was a real sense of movement and energy in these young women. So Fitzgerald gave a voice to this new figure. This Side of Paradise was an enormous success. It sold out in 24 hours. I think that 3,000 copies were sold in 3 days. Or actually 3,000 copies were sold in 24 hours, and they had a new printing within the space of 3 days. There were 12 more printings by the end of 1921. Yeah, this quote that I have from The Crack-Up, which is a wonderful essay that Fitzgerald wrote in the 30s on early success. When the fulfilled future and the wistful past were mingled in a single glorious moment, when life was literally a dream. And I think Fitzgerald felt for the rest of his life that that moment of success with This Side of Paradise was the moment, was the high point of his life. And after that, things got more difficult. It was because of the success of This Side of Paradise that Fitzgerald convinced Zelda to marry him. She had refused to marry him because he seemed to not have much of a future. He seemed penniless. And suddenly, he was this famous author, so she said, okay, I'll marry you. And you can see, again, the way that women and success get tied together in his life. The book was generally praised by critics, though some called it sloppy and cocky, impudent instead of confident and verbose. And I would agree with them. I think it's not my favorite Fitzgerald novel. Second novel Fitzgerald wrote, The Beautiful and the Damned, also not much read nowadays, but a beautiful novel, I think, an important novel. And I refer to it as the Janus face of success, because it's in that novel where Fitzgerald first explores the rise and fall of two figures, Anthony and Gloria Patch. She, again, the sort of embodiment of a flapper, Anthony Patch, the grandson of a great industrialist who sees his fortune fall away. So at the end of the novel, they're poor. So the arc of the novel is from beauty to damnation, from an early romance to harsh realism. And it's this novel where, and I think Fitzgerald had a great respect for Theodore Dreiser. I'm not sure if you know of Dreiser's work, but he to me is one of the greatest American writers. Sister Carrie being his first major novel. But in the 1920s, Dreiser wrote an incredible novel called An American Tragedy. And I think Fitzgerald is picking up on the Dreiserian influence in The Beautiful and the Damned. It's a very dark book, as is all of Dreiser's work. The Beautiful and the Damned locates failure. Well, it talks about success in the beginning, but then the novel is mostly about failure. And it locates failure in two sources, wealth and alcoholism, both of which, Fitzgerald writes, produce facile mediocrity. And it also introduces an interesting sub-character, which will, again, appear in every major novel that Fitzgerald writes after this point. And that's the Jewish figure who's changed his name, Joseph Blockman, who becomes Joseph Black. And it's sort of anti-hero, but remains successful, as opposed to the hero who becomes a failure. The Jewish figure that Fitzgerald feels sort of unsure about in his writing retains his success throughout the novel. And let me just read to you a description of Anthony Patch in the beginning. His nose was too sharp. His mouth was one of those unfortunate mirrors of mood inclined to droop perceptibly in moments of unhappiness. But his blue eyes were charming, whether alert with intelligence or half closed in an expression of melancholy humor. One of those men devoid of the symmetry of feature essential to the Aryan ideal. He was yet here and there considered handsome. Moreover, he was very clean in appearance and in reality, with that especial cleanness borrowed from beauty. And the description of Gloria, who was soon to become the wife of Anthony Patch. And it's a description of her as entering into a room with Anthony. Carefully, Gloria considered several locations in which to sit, and rather to Anthony's annoyance, paraded him circuitously to a table for two at the far side of the room. Reaching it, she again considered. Would she sit on the right or on the left? Her beautiful eyes and lips were very grave as she made her choice, and Anthony thought again how naive was her every gesture. She took all the things of life for hers to choose from and apportion, as though she were continually picking out presents for herself from an inexhaustible counter. So you have this sense of this beautiful young woman, again, a sort of flapper figure, who Anthony has fallen in love with, but who has this real naive narcissism. And you'll see that picked up again when he talks about Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. And it ends terribly. There's a fight at the very end of the novel where they can't divorce, but they can't stay together. And each of them unable to impress the other, each of them tremendously, achingly bored with each other. And it's really the portrait of the dissolution of a marriage that's very, very harsh at the end. While Fitzgerald was writing his novels, he also was writing many short stories. He wrote 160 short stories during the 1920s and 1930s. Those were the things that really allowed him to live, because Fitzgerald, as I haven't emphasized this, was continuously in debt, largely as a result of sort of excessive spending, incipient alcohol problems, Zelda's sort of spending habits. So Fitzgerald was always in debt, and he wrote these stories to make quick money. He made between $2,000 and $4,000 a story, which is an enormous amount at this time. Most of these stories he considered to be trash, but still you can see there's many interesting parallels between the stories and the novels. And certainly some of the stories are well worth reading. The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, and of course the Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which was turned into a movie a couple of years ago. So those are just three among many. One of my favorite short stories that he wrote is called Winter Dreams, which is a prototype for The Great Gatsby. So if you're interested in The Great Gatsby, you might want to look at that short story. Finally, Fitzgerald's masterpiece, what many consider his masterpiece, The Great Gatsby, was published in 1925, written while Fitzgerald and Zelda went to France for a sojourn. It's a book that I describe in terms of deepening disillusion. You can already see how the disillusion is growing in a book like The Beautiful and the Damned. 2 years later, there's this real feeling in Fitzgerald's writing that some of the energies and excitements and dreams that he was talking about in his first works are really now no longer, he can no longer talk about them in the same way. And I saw an interesting parallel between the short story, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz, where he refers to a vulgar, greedy America where everything is sacrificed to gross wealth, and Gatsby, where at the end of the novel he describes the two Buchanan figures, Tom and Daisy, as careless people. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness and let other people clean up the mess they had made. So a deepening sense in Fitzgerald's social and literary conscience of the inherent kind of problem of this excess wealth that he saw pervading America. It's interesting because a lot of people make parallels between the 20s and, say, recent epochs where you have these huge disparities of wealth between rich and poor. And I think that was something that Fitzgerald was very sensitive to as well. J. Gatsby, although he himself is, in a way, complicit with this world of vulgar wealth, he also embodies what we would call the American dream. What's great about the novel, undoubtedly, is Fitzgerald's ability to combine these two aspects of Gatsby. So on the one hand, he represents the best of America. He had, and I want to read the whole passage because it's just so beautiful. I can't find that particular one. Oh yes, here we go. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction, Gatsby who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. This is Nick Carraway speaking. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. So it's a novel, and I've actually written on this because I'm fascinated by that. It's a novel that takes the character of Gatsby, takes this extraordinary gift for hope, and shows how it sustains him despite the fact that he's murdered at the end of the novel and he doesn't turn out all right, but in a way he does turn out all right because that hope, that dream, that aspiration is always sustaining him. And at the same time, you know, Nick Carraway begins that passage by saying, Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. He's vulgar, he's materialistic, he tries to speak in a sort of elegant way and mangles his words. He wears pink suits, I mean, you know, vulgar. And, you know, ultimately he sort of ends up stalking Daisy Buchanan. I don't know if you remember the passage where he's standing outside her window, gazing up at her window for hours. So there's a lot about him and he's associating with criminals, bootleggers, and people who are rigging the World Series. And so he's not exactly a noble figure. In fact, you know, he represents everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. And yet there's something about him that holds the best of Americans. So it's really Fitzgerald's ability to combine these two characterizations that are so important. I wanted to show you the original cover of The Great Gatsby. I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's actually on the Scribner edition, but it's much more beautiful, I think, in the real colors. And what do you notice about that cover? Anything in particular? I mean, I always find something new in it. It's the image of a woman's face, right? With a tear, presumably a tear. And do you notice anything about the eyes? Yeah. They have, they're naked women in the eyes. Can you see that? Sort of, you know, sort of like an Art Nouveau kind of woman sketched into the eyes. So the question is, what does that sort of suggest? You know, why would you have those naked women in the eyes of a woman looking out of the cover, reflected maybe in her eyes? And does the tear have anything to do with that reflection of the naked women? Is there's some mystery in her face, something that she's looking at or that she herself represents that is embodied, I think, in this beautiful cover. And then down here, you also have this crack-up, this sort of, you know, crash, or maybe a carnival scene. It's hard to tell exactly what that is. But remember, there's an important car crash in The Great Gatsby, too, which this may be referring to. Anyway, I just wanted you to see that cover. Gatsby was a critical success and a commercial failure. It's remarkable to me that it really didn't sell much at all. It's 20,000 copies, which was half of what he had sold with his earlier novels. It was deemed too short, too much of a period piece, and too anecdotal. And it went out of print in 1926 and didn't go back into print until after Fitzgerald's death in the 40s. However, his peers felt that it was an extraordinary book, Maxwell Perkins, suggestive of all sorts of thoughts and moods. Gertrude Stein referred to him as creating the contemporary world, and Hemingway, his friend, called it an absolutely first-rate book. Things went downhill after the publication of Gatsby in Fitzgerald's own personal life. The years 1925 to 1930 were marked by a few sort of tragic events, infidelity on both sides. This is a picture of the young woman that Fitzgerald met when he first went out to Hollywood in 1927, a woman named Lois Moran, and he refers to this as a sort of revenge for an affair that Zelda Sayer, his wife, had in the summer of 1924 with a Frenchman. That summer of 1924, I knew something had happened that could never be repaired. So infidelity and, unfortunately, madness. Zelda had her first mental breakdown, her first severe mental breakdown. It seems very likely that she had episodes of schizophrenia before this point, but her first one was in April of 1930, which was preceded by a period of intense artistic creativity that's documented in that autobiography, Save Me the Waltz. And in the 30s, Fitzgerald wrote a letter to Zelda, "You were going crazy and calling it genius. I was going to ruin and calling it anything that came to hand." And finally, alcoholism, which was probably the nail in the coffin for both F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda. Lois Moran, the woman with whom he'd had the affair in 27, said, "When I saw him in 33, 34, and 35, he was so different from the man I'd known before, I just wanted to run." And Fitzgerald said to Zelda at the same time, "I was alone all the time and I had to get drunk before I could leave you, so sick and not care." And finally, Hemingway, "Bullfights were sedatives compared to weekends with Fitzgerald," which is saying a lot, given how much Hemingway drank. So the drinking just was escalated completely out of control. I mean, one of the most shocking things I ever read was an account of Fitzgerald after he stopped drinking in the late 30s. He went to Hollywood and stopped drinking. And in order to make up for the fact that he didn't have the alcohol in his body, he had to drink, what was it? It was 6 or 8 bottles of Coke a day in order to just keep his system running. And I just had, I don't know, for some reason that really shocked me, all that Coke. Tender is the Night, my favorite Fitzgerald novel, although not by any means his masterpiece. It's a novel that goes in many different directions. Fitzgerald has 2 ways of writing: short, tight, circumscribed, and very lyrical, and long, expository, extensively detailed, almost endlessly rich. Also very lyrical, but you feel like the novel has to come to an end at a certain point. And the 2 short novels that he wrote, The Great Gatsby and The Last Tycoon, can be contrasted with the 3 long ones, This Side of Paradise, The Beautiful and the Damned, and Tender is the Night, which is just, it's a huge, beautiful, epic novel, but it seems like it really should have been edited a little bit better than it was. It tells the story of Dick Diver, lucky Dick Diver, the doctor husband of a woman named Nicole, who herself is placed in a sanitarium as Zelda was in Switzerland. And it sort of tells the story of the tragic life that Dick and Nicole share and that parallels his own life with Zelda. And one critic writes, it affectingly mirrors Fitzgerald's sense of his own eroded hopes. And I'll just read a quick passage of about a description of Dick Diver coming to terms with the fact, I mean, he's lucky to the extent that his early years have been marked by success. And he's always been a very, he's gotten every fellowship he's applied for, and he's gotten all of the positions he's wanted. And then suddenly things start going wrong. And he starts thinking that maybe his life is taking a turn for the worse. God, am I like the rest after all? So he used to think starting awake at night. Am I like the rest? The truth was that for some months he had been going through that partitioning of the things of youth, wherein it is decided whether or not to die for what one no longer believes in. In the dead white hours in Zurich, staring into a stranger's pantry across the upshine of a street lamp, he used to think that he wanted to be good, he wanted to be kind, he wanted to be brave and wise, but it was all seeming pretty difficult now. He wanted to be loved too, if he could fit it in, but it was all seeming pretty difficult now. So again, you have that sense of a life sort of in decline. Fitzgerald would eventually make his way out to Hollywood after many events, but particularly the financial need to sell a screenplay to make money quickly. And in fact, since he was still quite well known in the 30s, he signed a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to make a few movies, Three Comrades, Infidelity, and The Women. And but he was, a partner scriptwriter on those sets. He was not the chief scriptwriter. But he did manage to make quite a bit of money. And in many ways, those final years in Hollywood were the beginning of a new kind of success for him. Although he had a few drawbacks, 1939, he made the infamous film Winter Carnival, or he helped to write the screenplay for Winter Carnival. I don't know if you've ever heard of this movie, but it's set in Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, and it's a kind of like, spree, sort of wintertime frolic movie. But Fitzgerald went to Hanover to work on the screenplay and sort of do primary research, and he was so drunk for the entire time he was there that he was actually told that he was sent on a train to New York and said, "You're off the movie." So that was the kind of thing that happened with frequency in Fitzgerald's life. The alcoholism just took over. And in 1940, he wrote, "My great dreams about this place, about Hollywood, are shattered," suggesting that, even though he was having a modicum of success in the 30s, it still was, the dreams were no longer being fulfilled in the way that he had hoped they would be. The last novel that Fitzgerald wrote, and also a great novel, is unfinished. And it was called The Last Tycoon. It was actually called, the original title was The Love of the Last Tycoon, a Western. So it was Fitzgerald's effort to write what he saw as a Western. It's a novel about Hollywood. And it's a novel about one figure in particular, a man named Irving Thalberg, who was a famous producer in the 30s. I think it's also Fitzgerald's effort to write a novel about a Jewish character. Again, I think he was fascinated by the figure of the Jewish entrepreneur, and this is a story about Fitzgerald that hasn't really been told, but I do think this last novel was an effort to focus on a Jewish character as a main character. In fact, Fitzgerald writes in his first draft of the novel, "The Hollywood producers have not had the early advantages which are considered standard, and it is not very kindly nor Christian to mock at them." And I think he's referring there to the Jewish producers in Hollywood who he was surrounded by and who he was very interested in. His final lover, Sheila Graham, was herself Jewish, and she introduced Fitzgerald to the community there. And was a liaison for him. And just one phrase to describe the Irving Thalberg character, who in The Last Tycoon is called Monroe Starr, S-T-A-H-R. But still, with the resonance of that idea of the star. Monroe Starr saw a new way of measuring our jerky hopes and graceful rogueries and awkward sorrows. So this new figure, this Hollywood producer, who Fitzgerald, I think, saw as arriving on the landscape of an America that had lost some of its sort of sparkles, lost the dreams that he talks about in the 1920s, that these Hollywood producers of the 1930s who are producing these films that he's involved in are offering a new way of measuring American hopes and dreams. So he's really anticipating the growth of the film industry and how important that's going to be in our culture. As I said, he died of a heart attack at the home of his lover, Sheila Graham, on the 21st of December, 1940, incidentally, a day or two before that of his very close friend Nathaniel West, who some of you may have heard of, a man who wrote another great Hollywood novel, The Day of the Locust. And they died more or less at the same time. It's really remarkable. Anyway, just a little tidbit there. And the last slide I wanted to show you before I close is a description of Fitzgerald's, going back to that idea of what he thought about America. He writes in 1939, "Our danger is imagining that we have resources, material and moral, that we haven't got." So instead of the dream being, the American dream being a sort of impetus that's driving us toward achievement and acquisition, it's actually something that's leading us towards something perhaps dangerous because we don't have the resources to achieve the things that we want to, or we don't have the material. He's not just talking about material resources, but moral resources to achieve our dreams. So a slightly darker vision of the American dream as the 30s come to a close. But then again, remember this great final passage of The Great Gatsby. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, dash. And I thought what's really interesting about this passage is the way the pronouns slip. I don't know if you noticed. Gatsby believed in the green light, the future that year by year recedes before us. And suddenly it's no longer Gatsby who's the subject of the sentence, it's us. And suddenly it eluded us then, us as both us and Gatsby. We've become one with Gatsby in that final description, as though his dream is our dream as well. And I think Fitzgerald does this a lot. You know, he sort of slides into this larger discussion of us as, you know, as Gatsby's sort of twins, Gatsby's parallels. And so he is the great chronicler, I would say, of the American dream and also of American failure. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any questions.